We are extremely happy to have you join us this afternoon. My name is Barbara Frey. I'm here with Ray Mancilla, and welcome to Enhancing Inclusiveness within the Quality Matters Framework. We just want to mention that Dr. Charline Rowland was formerly, she's a teaching consultant now, but she was formerly the diversity coordinator for the Teaching and Learning Center, and she shared a lot of valuable information with us. So we just want to recognize her contribution to the session today. But by way of introduction, we wanted to share a couple photographs so that you could see at least what I looked like when I could get a haircut before the pandemic. I'm formerly a senior instructional designer with Pitt Online, but I have recently made the move to assistant professor with Point Park University in Pittsburgh. I've been active with Quality Matters almost since the very, very beginning. In 2003, I remember a professor of mine at Penn State and a mentor also encouraging me to get involved with this great new organization called Quality Matters. And it's been a really worthwhile journey for me. And Ray?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Ray Mancilla, and I work formerly at Pitt Online at the University of Pittsburgh with Barbara, and I'm working now within the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences, doing instructional design work and management with our online program management provider, Noodle Partners. So I'm happy to work with Barbara on this presentation and share out some of the lessons that we've learned. And again, acknowledging Charlene's very important contributions to our work. And again, thank you. And we really hope that this presentation will be informative. And it will be very active, so there will be lots for you to do. So in terms of our goals, as all good instructional designers, we have our instructional objectives. Part of our goal today is to help you to differentiate between the terms diversity, inclusion, segregation, and integration with a focus on inclusiveness. And we'd like you to take some time today to proceed through some exercises on course materials, and some teaching practices, considering how they might become more inclusive, how we could potentially improve the level of inclusivity. We'll also touch back on the Quality Matters standards that address inclusivity and look at how we can address inclusivity by using the standards, and then finally developing strategies that can support the standards across any course discipline.
I'm sure you all use the Quality Matters rubrics, and you're very well aware of the valuable resource they are to you and to your faculty. The standards already include many best practices in inclusive design, and here's just a couple examples. Standard 1, the annotations emphasize the importance of communication etiquette and being respectful to all participants in the discussion board. Standard 3 actually has the language that assessment should be multiple and varied assessment strategies that give everyone a chance to demonstrate that they have mastered the objectives. Instructional materials, Standard 4, in the annotations, they specifically note open education resources. Again, giving every student the opportunity to learn and see different multimedia, different forms of materials and information. Standard 5 talks about the policies and your expectations for instructor interaction. Standard 7, the accessibility policies and accommodation statements are emphasized, and I think probably most of us have those in our syllabi. And Standard 8 talks about UDL guidelines, Universal Design for Learning, and the idea is that you proactively design a course that's as inclusive as possible so that you welcome all students into that learning environment. Examples might be using alt text or headings when you organize your documents. So those are some foundations that we're going to start on. So I think everybody is familiar with the standards, you're familiar with the annotations. Let's go on and build from that. Ray?
So we're just going to take a moment. We were hoping to use a whiteboard, but that's not available at the moment. So we're going to use the chat box just to take some time to collectively brainstorm what types of diversity you typically consider when you're designing or teaching a course. If you wouldn't mind, in the chat box, go ahead and type some ideas of the different types of diversity that you would take into consideration, and then we'll continue to generate and build that list. And please make sure you select all panelists and attendees when you're typing in the chat. Don't be shy.
Wow, we're seeing a whole lot here of different types of diversity. First generation, age, accessibility, gender, religious,
ethnic diversity.
Socioeconomic.
We also see concerns for accessibility and veteran status, religious diversity, gender diversity, racial diversity. We see hearing and visual impairments and non-native English speakers. Anyone have anything else to add? We see an open, friendly culture and safe space. Differences in learning. There's a lot to think about. Yes, thank you, Barbara. Yes, there's a lot to think about. We might add socioeconomic diversity to that list, age diversity. Yes, LGBTQIA. We might also consider levels of education. We might consider political diversity. So there's a lot to consider when we're looking at the umbrella of inclusivity in a course or in the development of our course materials. We're going to take a moment. Thank you for your participation in that activity. I'm going to give Barbara a chance to talk about some key terms.
Well, sometimes they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that's what we liked about this picture. We want to talk about a couple terms that we want to make sure that we are clear on what's the difference between these terms. If you start on the left, exclusion, the diagram shows that the image excludes people. There are people outside of the circle. They're being denied access into the circle. The second circle shows segregation. Segregation means that you're providing an opportunity to students, but they are being kept out of the mainstream. And we used to see that in public schools where the students with disabilities were kept out of the classroom before they were mainstreamed. Integration is providing students access to the materials, to your course, but it's not making any adaptations or modifications to your course. So that's what we're doing with accessibility. We may have students in our course that have special needs, that students who may be blind, students who may be deaf, but we're not proactively designing the materials for them. So our goal is inclusion, where we include materials that all students can access, that all students can use, and there's equal opportunities for them all to participate in the course, whether they be international students, students with a disability, no matter maybe a non-traditional student, but we want to include all students in the courses that we designed, and that's where we're going to focus now on inclusive design.
Thank you, Barbara. We're going to take a moment to examine one of the hallmarks of our online courses, the syllabus. And we all know that this is an important hub for any types of policy, institutional level, course level. We typically see diversity statements in our syllabi. Also, it sets the tone as one of the first touch points for students. So we want to make sure that our syllabus is always designed to be inclusive of all of these different types of diversity that we discussed just a few moments earlier. So Barbara has put a link inside of the chat box. And if you wouldn't mind copying that link into your browser, we'd like you to take a few minutes to glance over that syllabus from a student vantage and consider the types of what elements in the syllabus, what types of activities, what types of materials, what might be a barrier to inclusivity, and what elements might promote inclusivity from a student vantage, thinking about all of the different types of diversity that we just reviewed. And after a few moments, giving you a chance to read, then we'll come back here into this chat and we'll share our ideas. We'll take another minute to look over the syllabus before we start putting our ideas into the chat box. Okay, if you have any ideas to share, go ahead and type in the chat box parts of the syllabus that you feel. Let's start with promoting inclusivity. What elements might encourage everyone to feel welcome? Okay, we've got someone starting with the barriers. That's okay. So we have two barriers here so far. We say, someone says, oh, 3. What is meant by proper English? That could be difficult for someone who is a non-native English language speaker. I can completely understand that. That is, that's my previous life, teaching English as a second language. So yes, and we don't have the word diversity anywhere in the syllabus. So that's a very important observation because it's already setting the tone that this may not be a diverse course. Albert says one barrier is the limited hours of access to the instructor beyond class time. That is a very important observation as well. We know that non-traditional students tend to need those hours to be flexible, especially evenings and weekends, and we don't see that in the syllabus. And David Dare also says, we don't know how to address the instructor in the email, and we don't have links to the resources that they're supposed to access. So that can also be a barrier. Any other observations of barriers? We have a few. Thank you, Vanessa. Yes, it's all text-based, so there are no images in the syllabus that might provide a visual guide. So that's not very sensitive to learners who would need that visualization. Someone already mentioned the discussion board guidelines and proper English. Any other observations? Barbara, would you like to add anything?
I would like to draw people's attention to the readings. All those readings are US readings. It's all United States American publications. There's no international journals there that might add a unique perspective to the course. So that's one of the things that jumped out to me at first.
I also noticed that there are no late exams and that religious holidays require advanced approval. So that's also something to consider when you're drafting the language in your syllabus, how we might accommodate students of various religious backgrounds. And clearly, no late exams, that's going to be problematic for a student in an emergency situation or in a different time zone, for example. And Deb has mentioned, again, no variation in the assessment. So we know how important it is to provide that outlet for students to demonstrate their understanding through multiple means. And if you notice, there is a line in the syllabus that is assistance for students with special needs. It uses a gender-based language. I believe it uses his. So we want to stay away from that gendered language in this core document. Oh, interesting. So our host, Barbara, has mentioned that it might be helpful when you're creating a syllabus for more than one person to take a look at it, to explore that and to consider it from a student perspective and to look for ways that there might be barriers to inclusivity. That's a wonderful suggestion. Is there anything in the syllabus that catches your eye that might promote inclusivity? Because we know as instructors that when we're creating materials, many times we're not being exclusive by intention. Often it's an oversight or a failure to consider these different populations, which is why having another set of eyes could be so helpful. There is one element that I do feel is an attempt in the syllabus to help to make the course more inclusive and to create that culture. It does have an inclusiveness statement in the syllabus. So that is one element. Yes, thank you, Beth. The inclusiveness statement is one aspect that does promote inclusiveness. So this is a good exercise, I think, to sort of jar us from, our current practices, helping us to see and examine our practice more closely. And this is a fantastic example of ways that we can make our course more inclusive by design. So most of the things that you've all called out, these observations are, they're not hard fixes. In many cases, we can consider updating the language. We can consider expanding those discussion board guidelines, considering alternative forms of assessment, adding contact information, expanding office hours. So you see that there are ways that we can quickly and somewhat effortlessly address these needs. So I'd like to move on. Thank you for participating. Your active participation is very helpful. I'd like to let Barbara summarize some of the best practices for inclusivity.
Yeah, let's just summarize some things that you might think about when you design your syllabus. Do you have convenient office hours? Do you make it clear when you're available? I always cringe when I see a syllabus that says the instructor doesn't check email over the weekend. And if that's what you decide to do and that's your decision, just make sure that students are well aware that if you have non-traditional students, they may do most of their work on the weekend, and you would want them to know that you're not available on the weekend, and they better check the course, Thursday night in case they have some questions.
And course analytics can provide that type of information to you. When are your students accessing the assignments, and when are they logging on, and for how long?
Mm-hmm. You want to be aware of economic and time demands placed on your students. I just reviewed a course yesterday that had a open ebook for the textbook. So kudos to that instructor who was able to find something that worked well for his course. You want to have a variety of authors, perspectives, and text. And you do want to try to include some international sources. OER whenever possible, I just mentioned that. A variety of assessment types. Especially when, for some of the STEM courses, I see a lot of syllabi that are heavily based on exams. So is there something else that your students can do besides complete objective exams to demonstrate that they understand the material and that they have met your learning objectives? If you want to discuss guidelines that should be considered for linguistic diversity, just recognizing that English might be a second language for many students. You want to make sure that you recognize that there are religious observations that many students have to abide by or want to abide by, and you want to build a little bit of flexibility into your course for that. You want to provide resources for students with disability, and you want to make sure that language is student first terminology, which means it would be students who are blind or students with vision impairments rather than saying the blind students. So you want to be respectful. You want to be aware of gender neutral terms. And I'm from the old school, so I still say he, she, and I catch myself all the time that I have to go back and edit things. In fact, some of my older materials, I have to edit them, and I now replace that with they, because they is now, it doesn't sound right to me, but that's the correct way to use the pronouns these days. You want to make sure that your schedule is clear and specific. There may be emergencies, and we saw it this semester when you have to alter your syllabus or your schedule a little bit. But many students depend on that schedule to create their own time management schedule, and they need that to be accurate. So just a few things to think about in inclusive design.
And we do have a question here on clarifying what we mean by discussion guidelines and how they should consider linguistic diversity. And what does that look like when we express that to students as a faculty or as a course facilitator? And one piece is that with linguistic diversity, recognizing that there are, for example, many legitimate forms of English, depending on where a student where they've been raised, their specific linguistic variety. So many times we see in discussion board guidelines things like proper English or grading that is based on mechanics, and taking into consideration that everyone's mechanics may be different. Also being cognizant of slang or usage of terminology that may be specific to a specific region, acknowledging that students may have different vocabulary words for a specific term. So understanding that when you are producing your guidelines, you're aware that all forms of English are welcome, and understanding that students who are coming from a different linguistic background, not English, may have differences in their mechanics. They may change the word order, they may change the verb order, and deciding that you're going to grade on comprehensibility, not necessarily on specific grammatical correctness. So that's one way that you can show students that they're welcome in the discussion board guidelines, and being sure that you're not using humor, for example, to communicate. That's a huge piece. Humor is so hard to understand across different languages, regional terminology. Just avoiding language that could cause confusion is another strategy.
We have a good comment here. One of the participants says, I teach sociology and have learned how hard it is to find a textbook that is inclusive. So often it requires the instructor to actually to supplement the textbook to include different types of resources or research. And I think that's a good point. If you have a textbook you like and it's not ideal, then perhaps you could supplement it.
And we do have a comment about what do we do when we're teaching a course where standard American English is required as part of the preparation for the course, and how do we hold students to a high standard of writing and still be sensitive to linguistic diversity? And I think that we still want to hold students to a high level, but we are going to need to provide them resources, for the writing center, for a peer tutor, making comments that are private to students, helping them work on their writing offline through, emails. I think that's all part of the formation, and being sensitive, giving them the opportunity to rewrite, repost. So I think that there really is a balance. But these are wonderful comments, and I'm so glad that everyone's engaged in the discussion today. Thank you, Barbara, for moving forward with the best practices. And the next activity we have is a diversity statement we'd like to share. Oh, pardon. When we were looking at the statement for inclusivity, sometimes it's called a diversity statement. It's a message to students that it can be placed in the course orientation materials, it can be placed in the course syllabus, but it's really demonstrative. Pardon, every time I touch my screen, it moves the slide forward. But it's a commitment that you are going to provide this supportive climate where all students feel comfortable learning and can learn, and that they can see themselves represented in the course in some way, that they can identify with the course. And like I said, these can be found in the course syllabus or in other orientation materials, and they can be pertinent to you as an instructor, so they can reflect your own experiences with diversity. They might also reflect experiences that are relevant for your discipline. So as you're thinking about creating a diversity statement, maybe you have one, or maybe you want to make yours more robust, you might want to consider, how do you personally recognize and value diversity in the online classroom? So, in that sense, do you have a system in place so that all students' voices can be heard? What do you do about that really chatty person in the chat room versus, how do you call out other students and involve them? Do you use lots of different types of examples to illustrate your concepts? How do you guide respectful discussions, whether they be asynchronous or synchronous? So thinking about how you personally are going to make way for diversity in your classroom, and thinking about how it could be an asset for learning. So for example, when you're creating case studies, or in my discipline with the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences, we use a lot of standardized patient intake interviews and so forth. Are we looking at different cultural backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, different first language backgrounds? How do we leverage diversity so that it is an asset for students? And then how can we manage issues that relate to diversity that arise throughout the course? For example, when you have a student who responds in a negative way to a controversial topic, or makes another student feel uncomfortable, a student from a different social or cultural background doesn't feel comfortable with the other students' responses on the discussion board, or in the Zoom room, or with their small groups in the learning management systems. What will you do to manage these types of encounters? Are you going to interject, for example, on the discussion board and clarify? Are you going to, send a warning to the student through email? Are you going to remove their post and ask them to repost? So, what will your plan be? How should students come to you if they feel that they are not being included in the course discussions or other parts of the course? How do you plan to monitor their input, and how might you refer them to other resources on campus? So is there a Center for Diversity and Inclusion? Is there an office of, Title IV initiative or Title IX initiatives that you might be able to send the students to? Are there other supports for them on campus? So these are all questions that you might consider, and as you're considering them and responding to them, putting those in writing in your diversity statement. And there's a lot of great information online that you can find examples of good diversity statements. We found some really great questions from the Carnegie Mellon Eberly Center, which is also located in Pittsburgh. But the University of Utah has plenty of resources as well. And I'm sure your individual institutions will likely have some sort of resource through the Office of Disabilities, perhaps that you could use. And we will share with you an example of a diversity statement.
So if you don't have a diversity statement, maybe you could just see if this one could be a starting point for you. And this comes from the University of Iowa. And forgive me, I'm going to read it. It is my intent that students from all diverse backgrounds and perspectives be well served by the course, that students' learning needs be addressed both in and out of class, and that the diversity that students bring to class be viewed as a resource, strength, and benefit. It is my intent to present materials and activities that are respectful of diversity, gender, sexuality, disability, age, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, race, and culture. Your suggestions are encouraged and appreciated. Please let me know ways to improve the effectiveness of the course for you personally or for other students or student groups. In addition, if any of our class meetings conflict with your religious events, please let me know so we can make arrangements for you. Right, so it hits on some important aspects of diversity and maybe gives you a starting point and some things to think about. Okay, next we are going to look at a case study. I put a link again in your chat, and if you would cut and paste that link for the case study into your browser, you can open that up and take a minute to read through the example. We want you to read this case study from the faculty perspective now. The syllabus we asked you to look at from the student perspective. We're going to ask you to look at the case study from the faculty perspective.
When you're ready, now that you've had an opportunity to read through, and feel free to download these and keep these as practice activities for your own professional development or to share with your colleagues. Let's consider these 3 areas that align with our QM standards. Thinking about here, question number 1, and again, we would love for you to, we wish you could all have microphone privileges, but please use the text box. How might Dr. Thomas prepare the students to talk about these sensitive topics in the future to avoid the situation that occurred with Jeremiah? And what specific suggestions might you add to enhance the inclusivity of the course assessments? And specifically, advice as he redesigns the online discussions. And we might add that this case was based on an actual situation. So we see here, thank you, Marilyn, for jumping in, that from the very beginning, men, according to these guidelines that he provided, did not have the chance to react to the TED Talk in the same way that the women did. So we might note that there was a women and men only discussion forum, and that the question sets differed. Thank you, Beth, that we need to provide some guidelines here for discussing the sensitive topics and not segregate by gender here on the discussion board. And Sandra, thank you. Setting those netiquette expectations first, some sort of agreement that students could sign, or an inclusiveness, kindness agreement. That's a great idea, to have students complete and sign off before they start the course, to acknowledge the expectations and commit to respecting one another. Any other thoughts so that we could help Dr. Thomas avoid this train wreck? Because this sounds like, you know, we lost a student here. We had lots of students who were offended. We had communications going out through email that should not have gone out. Looks like we involved some leadership here.
This isn't just an issue for diversity and inclusion. It's also an issue for civility in the classroom.
And I might add that there would be a great opportunity as a religious studies course. There should be some sort, maybe Dr. Thomas could, from the very beginning, provide context about the types of activities that are going to happen in the course, the types of materials that students would be viewing or engaging with, so that there would be no surprise. Like in the case of Jeremiah, you know, he seemed surprised by, you know, the TED Talk, surprised by the lecture. Thank you, Brenda. A reminder about communication expectation and what to do when you disagree with a topic, especially a hot topic, something controversial. You know, what are the guardrails? And we will be talking more about what those guardrails could look like. Any other thoughts before we
What if Dr.
this?
Thomas came walking into your office and sat down and, you know, told you about this? What advice would you have for him or her?
I think Brenda and Barbara Birch are on the same wavelength, that we can help involve students in setting the guidelines. So getting student input on what to do in these situations and what the communication standards should be. I love that, Marilyn. Some sort of heads up that lets students know that we're moving into a hot topic. You know, it's fronted for them. They are made aware of it. And maybe they're reminded at that point, again, of the netiquette guidelines, of the communication standards. And perhaps there could be some communication from Dr. Thomas about how to handle that situation if the student starts feeling uncomfortable. Oh, thank you, Sandra. She saw a great way to include students, that the instructor started a list and then all the students were to add one thing to the list so they could collectively generate and collaborate on the communication standards. I love it. Thank you. I would ask Dr. Thomas, what was the goal of this assignment? And
That's a
sometimes
good
it's
one.
important to provide that context to students in advance. This is why I'm asking you to complete this assignment. We did have a situation like this recently in some of the online courses that I've worked on where we were talking about healthcare and access to healthcare, and a student raised a question about, HIV positive individuals, and should they be allowed to do or access certain services? And the instructor was really flustered. Well, how do I respond, because the students are arguing on the discussion board about this topic now? And we had to go back and look at, what can we refer the students to? Where are the laws written? Can we bring in the facts here, and sort of de-escalate the interaction and provide opportunities for the students to learn from that and to expand their horizons. And we see Beth has another suggestion here about gender issues are broader than what Dr. Thomas has presented here. So that could also be a clarifying point. So these are all wonderful suggestions about how we could approach this type of a situation in the future, and understanding that the course design is iterative, and you may have an assignment like this blow up one year, and making strides to implement and be more proactive about inclusivity. One of the ways that you all suggested was looking at discussion board guidelines or guardrails. And even though we have lots of tools to implement asynchronous discussion, we're using, for example, Yellow Dig as one of our discussion formats. I know others use Piazza, lots of tools, but the idea of guidelines for communication can be extended across all of these formats, but providing some students some very specific and positive, like we tried to provide these as a positive wording, and not a don't do this, don't do that, but thinking about what students should do. So here's an example of some of the ideas that we came up with. Being patient and being brief. So that's also helpful because it makes students reconsider their message. Citing their sources, teaching students to be considerate of what they're borrowing from others, addressing one another by name, and keeping it personal, so that you recall that you're addressing another person. It's not just a name on a screen. It's not just an avatar. And also being careful with humor. We mentioned that sarcasm, emoticons, even capital letters can be very hard to interpret in the online space. Tone is hard to read into, and can be especially hard for students of different cultural or linguistic backgrounds. So we want to be sensitive to that. Also talking about how to give constructive feedback, so being balanced and sensitive. And many times that involves training students, especially when they're going to be providing extensive peer reviewing, providing them some guardrails around what does it mean to give constructive feedback, what are the elements of good feedback. And Quality Matters does such a wonderful job of teaching all of the reviewers, all of us who are course reviewers. We are all able to give positive, constructive feedback that is meaningful because of the training. So implementing that training for students, and then thinking carefully about audience, and understanding that many times once you post something, in some cases it can't be retracted without admin privileges. So in some cases the students they throw the paint on the wall, and it can be too late for them. So that's where the pathway, the remediation pathway comes in. What do we do when a student already does that? We saw that in the case with Dr. Thomas. Do we ask for apologies? Do we ask for the admin to step in and delete the post? And we have some good points here. Humor can be misunderstood. So that includes things like memes and images as well. They can be taken differently. Gestures can be taken differently across cultures. Do not attack the person and engage with their ideas. So while we want to be personable to one another and address by name, remembering that what we're responding to is the individual's thought, not attacking the person. Any other ideas that you think we should add here to this list? What else have we used in your discussion board guidelines or in your communication plans in the past? Okay, well, this is just a starting point and we can move beyond this in the future. Yes, being respectful to questions and asking questions rather than just immediately disagreeing. Fantastic. Okay, we're coming up on time, so I want to give Barbara a chance to close and recap a bit.
All right, let's come back to quality matters again in the rubric and the standards. And here's a couple additional strategies that maybe we didn't talk about in detail. But for standard 1, could you consider some kind of a diversity icebreaker? And there are many online, but if you want to look at something that I think is kind of interesting, that Harvard University has something that is called the implicit association tests. And they have tests for different types of cultures and individuals, religious, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. So there are different tests that students can take and react to and see how they score on these particular tests. But it might promote some awareness of diversity issues. When you are doing your assessments for standard 3, just a couple things that you might want to think about is, do you provide resources on plagiarism? There are cultures where copying other people's work and using it is a compliment, and some international students are really miffed by our plagiarism practices. So you may want to provide resources for that. And the other thing that I was surprised was when I used peer review, that there are some cultures that find that offensive because they think nobody should give them feedback or criticize their work except the teacher. The teacher is the expert and they shouldn't take feedback from any students. So all I did was, in the rubric that I used for that particular peer review, I took off numbers at the top of the columns instead of saying, excellent was 4, good was 3, needs work was 2. I just took off the numbers and students provided each other with some text feedback, nothing that seemed like it was evaluative. For instructional materials, we talked about using different journal articles, considering an international perspective, but I'm also going to ask you to look at the PowerPoints. Do you have images in your PowerPoints, and are those images inclusive of different cultures? For learning activities, I'm a big fan of group activities, and if you are assigning groups, I would suggest that you assign them. If you allow students to pick their own group, they may very well just go for their friends. So you may find a way that, even using numbers, that you can mix up the groups a little bit. And if there's more than one group assignment, you may want to shuffle those groups so that students have an opportunity to work with more than one student or one group of students. Learner support, we talk about this in the rubric. And of course, the first thing you think about is the library and the writing center and the math tutorial center. But are there other resources that we should be giving students, like a center for diversity, or perhaps a veterans office? There might be other resources that would be valuable to students. And last but not least, for standard 8 and accessibility, we talked about universal design for learning. Just be aware that sometimes those transcripts are not enough. If you have a student who is deaf, they will need help syncing the transcript with the video. So you really do need closed captioning, and sometimes the transcript alone is just not enough. So just some ideas to think about.
So helpful, Barbara. Thank you for sharing that, because they can be helpful even for second language learner. And they can be helpful for someone who's busy and wants to watch the transcript because they have kids crying in the back. And
or yeah, you're on a mobile device on the bus. I see we are out of time. Barbara, did we have any questions?
There are no questions built up in the Q&A right now. We've had some great participation and comments in the chat, but we can give it just a moment to see if there are any questions, because we are about to go into a break and won't need to be back from that until 3:30 p.m. So everybody should have a chance to get up and move about a little bit, and if they want to ask a quick question now, now's the time.
And I'd like to put the contact information up in case anybody would like to continue to reach us. You're welcome to reach out to us.
Thank you for everybody for your participation. That's always
yes, it's
the
made the
fear.
session so much more engaging.
Yes, you have valuable information to share.
Well, thank you for an excellent presentation and just a lot of great things to learn and good reminders too. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now and just want to thank you all so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, everybody.